We'll say good morning. It is a great zechus Baruch Hashem to be able to learn with all of you. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual TAMUD Torah sponsor, Tilson Family of Yisroel, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this year as a zechus for besuros tovos for all of Am Yisroel. Our TAMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Av: Ilene, Stephen, Wendy, Drazin, honor of Israel Drazin, Dina Drazin, Ilene Rosenzweig, and Stanley Rosenzweig, Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors: Dr. Ed and Faith Wolf, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Dr. Wolf's father, Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hersh, and Nathan and Beth Adler, in memory of their father, Ben Adler, HaChaver, Baruch, Mordechai, Ben Morenu, Nosson, and Zichron Livracha. And of course, as always, we dedicate our learning in the zechus of our precious hostages, Mechadish Baruch Hu, Hashem, bring them home, Shalom and Bekarov, and the merit of our holy soldiers, Mechadish Baruch Hu, give them success. B'chol Maaseh Yedei. And both say with that, let us begin. We have an exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Samech Gimel 63, and we are picking up on Samech Beis Beis 62b, Debei Rabbi Yanai, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara says as follows: Debei Rabbi Yanai, Yasvi Peri Shvius Manim, Uparlahu B'Shminis. So a very interesting case over here. The members of the household of Rabbi Yanai, what they would do is as follows: they would borrow Shemitah produce from the poor, and then repay them with 8th year produce, non-Shemitah produce, on the following year. So if you look at Rashi says over here something very interesting. Yasi Perishiyis, Kodin Zmanabir. So obviously, again, without getting into all the Shemitah technicalities over here, but halacha l'maisa, you can go ahead and lend or borrow, not commerce, but lend or borrow Shemitah produce while it's still readily available for everyone. So that's once it's no longer readily available in the field, you really can no longer kind of keep it for yourself. So the idea over here is, so the people of the house of Rabbi Yanai would borrow Shemitah produce from the Aniyim during the Shemitah year. Rashi goes on, the Parlu B'Shminis, Ishtachach Ta'achli Aniyim B'Shminis Acharabir Chalifi Peroshvias. So what ended up happening again is on year number 8, the people of Rabbi Yanai's household would repay the Aniyim, ultimately again with new produce, 8th year produce. So the Gemara says, Asu Amrli Rabbi Yochanan. So they came and they said, so people mentioned this practice to Rabbi Yochanan. There was something about it, obviously, that bothered people to some degree. So they said something to Rabbi Yochanan. Amrluhu, Rabbi Yochanan said, Yalusein Avdin, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. Why? Ukenegdan, now interestingly enough, look at Rashi, Yalusein Avdin, sorry, just do a couple of Rashis. Yalusein Avdin, there, Rabbi Yochanan said, the members of the house of Rabbi Yanai are acting totally fine. Rashi says, the chivon dahi shaita lo havu hanach be'en v'lo ichlufe hani bahani lav chalipe ninhu v'lo chayil kedusha shvias alayv. So remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf already, when you get into an issue of potential commerce with a forbidden item, so sometimes that forbidden identity could devolve upon the previously permitted item. So for example, the concern over here is, if this looks like one is transacting business with Shemitah produce, then even the 8th year produce should ultimately have Shemitah sanctity, Shemitah prohibition. Rabbi Yochanan said it's not really a problem. Why? Because there's not an immediacy, or I should say, there's no immediate reciprocity. Because the produce is being taken during the Shemitah year and only being quote-unquote repaid during year 8, because there's no immediate reciprocity, therefore this does not look like you're doing commerce with Shemitah produce, and therefore no Shemitah prohibition devolves upon the 8th year produce. That's the idea over here. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, and therefore, again, Shemitah sanctity will not develop upon the 8th year produce. And he says something very interesting, and he says, "U'kenegdan be'esnan mutar." And interestingly enough, a similar case would come up with esnan zona. Esnan zona is the halacha is if a person goes to a zona and he gives her something for her services, right? Obviously, if he pays her money, or even he gives her an object, that object is called an esnan zona, payment for a harlot, and cannot be used for any type of sacrificial purposes. Makes sense. So listen to this. The Sanya, the Gemara says a corresponding case passes on. What's the case? The Sanya, listen to this. Bryce says, Nosson la. Let's say Reuben goes to Rochel. Rochel's a zona, right? Reuben goes to Rochel, and ultimately, again, he gives her an essence, he gives her a payment, right? But he doesn't have relations with her. Or Ba'al havelo Nosson la. Or he has relations with her but doesn't pay her anything. What's the halacha? Esnana mutter. Her harlot's payment ultimately is mutter for sacrificial use. Okay, so obviously it doesn't make sense. Gemara says, I don't understand. Nosson la, if he gave her, let's say he gave her a lamb, he gave her a sheep, and he didn't have relations with her, then of course it's permitted for a karban. Why? Pshita. He didn't have relations with her. So if he didn't have relations with her, then ultimately, again, the lamb is a gift. If it's a gift, there's no restrictions on it. To which the Gemara says, furthermore, the second case, if he had relations with her, but he didn't pay her anything, ultimately he didn't pay her anything. And if he didn't pay her anything, if he didn't pay her anything, then what's the meaning of the statement in the Brisa that says that halacha l'maisa, the esnan is mutter? That doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara says, Ella hachi ka'amar. Rather, this is what it means to say. Listen to this. Nosson la, the achar kach ba'aleha. If he gave her, let's say he gave her the sheep, and then only afterwards, in other words, let me tell you this piece outside. Essentially, the Gemara is going to say it like this. When does something become an esnan zone, a harlot's payment? When there's transactional immediacy. He pays her, relations, right? Our relations pay her. In other words, when there's immediacy, that's when it's an esnan. If there is a lack of transactional immediacy, then the payment does not take on the status of esnan zona. And what that means practically is that it can be used ultimately, again, let's say for some type of sacrificial or temple use. So watch this. So Nosson, if he gave her the sheep, the achar kach ba'aleha. Now what does it mean, the achar kach ba'aleha? Rashi says, achshav elo la'achar zman. He doesn't have relations with her now. Rather, again, sometime later. Now, of course, how exactly do you go ahead and translate immediacy? I think there's some level of common sense. He pays her today and has relations with her in 3 hours from now or tomorrow. Again, as opposed to payment, relations. Or for that matter, he has relations with her and then only afterwards pays her. Esnana mutter. In both of these cases, ultimately, again, the esnan is going to be mutter. However, Nosson la, the achar kach, fine. So therefore, both sides, what the Gemara is saying is as follows, that essentially, in order for something to be categorized as an esnan zona, there has to be transactional immediacy. Once there's transactional immediacy, in other words, payment relations, then the lamb, the sheep, the payment, has the status ultimately, again, of a harlot's payment. Now, again, remember, just to keep track of what's going on over here. So remember, the household of Rabbi Yanai, they would borrow Shemitah produce from the poor and repay it ultimately, again, with 8th year produce. People came to Rabbi Yochanan because they felt, I don't know, maybe it looks like a little bit strange, this practice. You're transacting business with Shemitah produce, to which Rabbi Yochanan said, no, it's fine. Why? Same idea. There's no transactional immediacy. So because no transactional immediacy, we don't view that 8th year produce as an exchange, right? Or as somehow like a payment, ultimately, again, for the 7th year produce, the Shemitah produce, and therefore the 8th year produce remains totally fine. Fine. Now the Gemara questions a little bit this esnan case. Nosson la v'achar kach ba'ala. So again, let's go through this, right? Let's say he goes ahead and he pays her. Okay, Reuven pays Rochel. He gives her a sheep. I'm just using a sheep because it's the easiest example, ultimately, again, for sacrificial purposes, right? So he pays her a sheep, right? And then let's say he gives her a sheep on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, he has relations with her. So again, based on what we just learned before, that sheep does not have the status of a harlot's payment and therefore is not forbidden for consecrated temple use, right? Because it lacks transactional immediacy. The Gemara says, I don't understand. But when he does have relations with her, let's say on Wednesday, right? He gave her the sheep on Tuesday. He has relations with her on Wednesday. So why don't we say that when he does have relations with her, top of Samech Gimel, Lechol Allah Isser Esnan Lemafreya. Obviously, okay, I understand. When he gives her the sheep, it can't be labeled as esnan zona because he didn't have relations with her yet, and there's no immediacy. But when he does have relations with her on Wednesday, then retroactively the designation of the sheep as a harlot's payment should devolve upon the sheep retroactively, and therefore the sheep should be categorized as an esnan zona already as of Tuesday. Rabbi Lazar says it's very interesting. No, what's the case? Kishekadma behekrivaso. This is very interesting. What happened? The zona, right? The zona got the sheep on Tuesday. She got the sheep on Tuesday. Now, relations didn't happen until Wednesday. So the Gemara is saying, but when they have relations on Wednesday, retroactively, the sheep should be categorized as a harlot's payment. Oh, what's the case? She offered it up as a karban on Tuesday. She offered up as a karban on Tuesday. A pious harlot, a pious zona. Now, we'll say, you might say to yourself, come on, what a faker. She's a zona, and she's offering up karbanos. We'll say, it's important. We've mentioned this many times in the past. It's always important to understand we all live with inconsistencies and we all live with inherent contradictions. And in certain respects, I'm a tzaddik, and in certain respects, I'm a rasha. And there are things in my life that I do very well, and there are things in my life that I do very poorly, and there are things that I don't do at all. But here's the beauty of it. The things that I don't do well or do poorly or don't do at all, Baruch Hashem, don't take away from the things that I do well and that I'm righteous in. Yiddishkeit is not an all or nothing game. You could be righteous in some areas and morally bankrupt in other areas. Now, obviously, that's not the goal, right? The goal is to have a certain level of harmonious spirituality and righteousness in all areas of my life. But most of us are not there. But sometimes we feel hypocritical, or sometimes we feel like a fake because here, I'm learning Torah, but I'm doing this, or I'm giving tzedakah, but I'm doing this, or I do chesed, but I'm doing this. You're right, it is hypocritical, it is a little contradictory, but welcome to the nature of the human condition. We all live with hypocrisy, we all live with inner contradictions. Such is the nature of life. But it is important for us not to lose faith in ourselves, that even though the zona is a zona, but she also brings karbanos. And you know what? I guarantee you, those karbanos are a reach nichoach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a pleasing aroma, because at the end of the day, no one knows our inner contradictions, our inner struggles more than HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when we still push forward to do good, despite all the things that are broken, sometimes that's the pinnacle of human accomplishment. In any event, so the Zona offered up the carbonara. So by the time relations occurred on Wednesday, the animal was already gone. She already offered it up. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Let's unpack this a little bit. What's the case? If he said to the Zona, gives her the lamb on Tuesday and says, this is yours as of today, right? Acquire this as of today, right? Then halacha l'maisa pshita the sharila, right? The halesa b'shas bia umatana ba'amahu diyoivla. So then obviously it's mutter for, right? Because she has title to it. It can't be categorized as an esnan on Tuesday because they didn't have relations yet. So essentially he gave her a gift, and therefore she has every right to offer it up. However, this is very interesting. But if he did not give her permission to acquire it as of now, right? If he was not explicit and said, if he didn't say to her, this is your animal as of now, as of Tuesday, right? They're scheduled for relations on Wednesday. So what does it mean? So if he gives it to her, he gives it to her on Tuesday, okay, we're going to have relations tomorrow. If that's the case, if he doesn't tell her to acquire it, it's not hers. It's not hers. And if it's not hers, how could she offer it up as a carbon? After all, the Torah says, if a person will consecrate his home, this is talking about an erech vow, valuation, right? Will go ahead and consecrate his home. Just like your home, you own it. So to the only thing you can consecrate, whether it's consecrate or whether it's offer up, is something that you own. In other words, so if she doesn't own it on Tuesday, then how could she offer it up as a carbon? I'll say, just by the way, a tremendous another Musa Haskell over here. What is it? You could only be makdish something that is yours, which means in the realm of personal growth, HaKadosh Baruch Hu only asks of us what we're able to do. Sometimes we make the mistake of measuring ourselves against other people. And that's not necessarily the right thing to do. It's good to have role models, and it's definitely good to have people who we look up to, who we aspire to be like. But a lot of times we kind of compare ourselves to others, and then we're frustrated when we don't measure up. But who says you can measure up to someone else? You don't know what those person's kohos are, what their abilities are. The Ribono Shel Olam only asks you to be makdish that which you own. You only have to consecrate, or you only can consecrate that which you own. You can't consecrate something that doesn't belong to you. We so often in life, we forget that HaKadosh Baruch Hu only expects of us what we're able to do. He doesn't expect of me what someone else could do. He doesn't expect of me someone else's accomplishments. What he does expect of me is to take a personalistic inventory about all the spiritual tools that I possess. Be honest about what I possess, because we possess a lot more than often we're honest about. And then utilize those in the pursuit of personalistic holiness. You could only be makdish that which belongs to you. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu only asks of us to accomplish spiritual things that are within our purview, within our power, within our spiritual toolbox. Incredible. Eladamarla, so what's the case? Eladamarla, ve'havi gabech ad shas bia. This is very interesting. So he says to her, right, so Reuven gives this to the Zona, the sheep, on Tuesday, and he says, okay, Keep the sheep with you. We're scheduled for Bia tomorrow, right? And just keep it with you until tomorrow. But if you need the sheep for some reason, let's say something comes up, you need the sheep, I don't know, you need a carbon, or you need dinner, whatever it is, then Gemara says, then I give you the right to acquire it as of now. So it's interesting, kind of hedges his bets a little bit over here. Fine. So the Gemara says, so therefore we'll say that's the zona case. Now again, what's the idea? Why are we doing this? Besides the fact that it's Torah and we have to learn it, and it's interesting. We're doing this because, again, remember, this all happened with the Be'er Rabbi Yanai, with this Shemitah transaction. And the idea that's kind of happening over here is that something could only be vested with prohibited status when there is a level of transactional immediacy. So now we see that by the Shemitah case, and ultimately we see it by the Esnan zone and by the harlot payment case as well. I think Gemara just gets a little bit into this harlot payment case. So by Rav Oshia, Kalma Bekdisha Salmai. This is very interesting. So let's say, same thing. Reuben gives Zona the sheep on Tuesday. The Bia is scheduled for Wednesday. On Tuesday, she goes in and she's makdish it. She consecrates it. Now, she didn't offer it up as a carbon, but she's makdish it. So what's the status now of the animal? Mahu. Kevan da amar amirasa legavo kemisirasa lehedyot keman dakri vasedami. So do we say that essentially making something hektish is the equivalent of offering it up? In other words, literally the Gemara says that verbally pledging something to hektish is the equivalent of giving it over to a regular person. So therefore, do we say ultimately again that the act of going ahead and being makdish it verbally is the equivalent of offering it up? Or no. In other words, offering it up is offering it up, but being because it's gone, the animal's gone. Being makdish, ultimately again, it is still here, it is still present. So does she have the ability? What happens if she was makdish it? Again, because I will say, you heard the shaila is, in the case where she offered it up on Tuesday, by the time the bia occurs, obviously, again, it's gone. It's gone, right? So it can't be called an esnan zona because it was no longer in existence at the time that the bia occurred. In this case over here, on Tuesday, she's makdish it. Wednesday, the bia occurs. And ultimately, so at the time of the bia, the object is still here. So now the shaila is, does the object become an esnan zona or not? So Gemara says, "V'tiv shamid Rabbi Eliezer." We can listen to Rabbi Eliezer. What does Rabbi Eliezer say? So we'll say, going back, this is Rabbi Eliezer on the top of the daf, right? The Gemara says, "Dam Rabbi Eliezer shekadma v'hekri vaso." So remember again, the way Rabbi Eliezer understood the case of the esnan zona, right, is where she went ahead and she already offered it, right? She offered it up already by the time that the bia occurred. Dafka hekri vaso. So dafka, it's because she offered it up, it's no longer in existence. Aval hekdishaso lo. But from Rabbi Eliezer's statement, it would appear that if she was makdish it, but the animal was still in existence at the time that the bia occurred, perhaps the animal would now be called an esnan zona. The Gemara says, no, the Rabbi Eliezer gufei kami baile. The truth is, this shaila is mamish a shaila Rabbi Eliezer himself. So the Gemara says, mai, mifshat pshita the Rabbi Eliezer dakrivaso davka vakdisha solo da isa b'shas bia. Does Rabbi Eliezer say that the only time it doesn't become an esnan is when the animal was offered up before the bia? Because by the time the bia occurs, the animal is no longer here. But perhaps, again, where she was just makdish, she consecrated it, but the animal is still in existence at the time of the bia, in which case, halacha l'maisa, the animal is recategorized as an esnan zona. Al dilma, hikrivasa pshitale, vikdishasa mesapkale. Or maybe no, maybe obviously if she offered it up and it's no longer in existence at the time of the bia, of course it's not going to be categorized as an esnan zona. But in a case where she just consecrated it, we're not sure. To which the Gemara says, Teku. So we're really not sure. So interestingly enough, Rabbi, what comes out in this case over here is, first of all, so important lesson number one, because we're not finished with esnan zona yet. But what we do understand is that in order for something to be categorized as an esnan zona, as a heartless payment, there must be transactional immediacy, which means payment, bia. If that order is not followed, either payment and delayed bia, or bia and then payment, ultimately, again, it is not considered to be an esnan zona. If he deposited an animal with her for payments, now, and the bia doesn't occur until later on, assuming she has rights in that animal, therefore, if she goes ahead and she offers it up, it's a bona fide carbon. If she's makdish it, she consecrates it, and so the animal is still in existence at the time of the bia the next day, what's the status of that animal? That's the take. That's the unknown. Okay, let's analyze more. So remember, again, both sides. The second case over here was, let's say he has relations with her, and then afterwards he pays her. So ultimately, again, the payment is mutter. When we say it's mutter, it means it can be used for consecrated or sacrificial purposes. Or mini, the Gemara is a kasha. I don't understand this. The Gemara says, or minhi, ba'ala v'achakach nasallah, afilu mikan ad shalosh shonim esnana asa. We have a brisa. The brisa says if Reuben has relations with the zona, and then he pays her even 3 years late. 3 years late. Some people pay all of their bills late. Right? So he pays her late. Right? 3 years later, it's still called the harlot's payment, and it'll still be aser. Amrav Nachman Yitzchak, Amrav Chisda, Lo Kashya. So both say that contradicts what we just said before, because the brisa that we quoted before on Sanach Beis and Beis 62b said that if there's relations and then payment, that's not an esnon. There's no transactional immediacy. Here the Gemara says if there's relations, even if he pays her 3 years later, ultimately it is still aser. Amrav Nachman Yitzchak, Amrav Chisda, Lo Kashya. It's not a contradiction. Hada Amar his Baali li betalazeh. Hada Amar his Baali li betalastam. So I say this is very interesting. Ultimately, again, one case is talking about a case where he says, have relations with me for this sheep, and he identifies the sheep, versus have relations with me for a sheep. Look at Rashi, betalazeh, kol kama diyohev lo have esnan de mehashta kenise. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says when he identifies the sheep, it's as if there is transactional immediacy. When he doesn't go ahead and identify the sheep, then ultimately, again, there is no transactional immediacy. All right, so let's analyze a little bit more. My hobby, I don't understand. So let's analyze this, right? So now it's Wednesday. Reuben goes over to Rochel. He says, have relations with, or to Zona. He says, have relations with me for this sheep. Now, but yeah, he doesn't pay her for 3 years. 3 years. The halacha is, it has the status of a harlot's payment because there's transactional immediacy. Just because he identified the sheep, it doesn't make it hers. In order for it to be hers, what has to happen? The Gemara says, Mishicha. Right? Remember, livestock, animals require Mishicha, require taking possession. To which the Gemara said, okay, so apparently it's actually interesting that ultimately the din of Mishicha is only a din by Jews. So apparently, again, by a non-Jew, they don't need Mashiach to acquire. So we're talking about a zona who's not Jewish. All right. The other possibility is Liolam bezoni Yisraelis. No, it's talking about a Jewish harlot. Ukigon dekoi bechatzera. Oh, interestingly enough, the sheep is standing in her chatzar. In which case, again, ultimately, there's kinyan chatzar. She acquires it. Rest 1 second. Either kai bechatzera ba v'achakach nasala hakanyala. But 1 second. I don't understand. If it's in her chatzar, then she acquires it. In other words, if he had relations with her, and then ultimately, again, then he gave it to her, only then he gave it to her. It's already in her chatzar. She already acquired it. What are we talking about over here? The Gemara says, in other words, she acquired it before Bia. So this is like the paradigmatic case of Esnan Zona, because she's acquiring the sheep even before the Bia, if the sheep is standing in her chatzar. To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha, the Shavya Neheli Apotiki. Very interesting. Now, here's the case. So Reuben comes to Rochel on Wednesday. He says, "Listen, we're gonna here. This sheep is an apotiki." Now remember again, what is apotiki? Apotiki essentially is like a guarantor. In other words, he says to her, "I'm gonna pay you. I'm gonna pay you for the relations, right? If I don't pay you money, you could take this sheep." So therefore, she doesn't really acquire the sheep initially. She only acquires the sheep in the event that there is non-payment. The Amar Law. And he says to her, if I pay you, let's say within the next 30 days, good. And if not, take this sheep ultimately again as your harlot payment. Fine. Master Rav Sheshes says like this. So now, again, it's interesting. All of this is really unraveling from the Estan Zona case. Watch this. Omer Adam lechamarav ulapalav. So let's say again, let's say Ruvain employs donkey drivers and workers. Okay, so now he's paying them. Now the way ultimately again he's paying them. Now Rashi points out over here, either these workers are non-Jews or they're Amei Aretz. They're just unlearned Jews. Idolaters are unlearned Jews. Now you'll see why this is important in just a moment. And he says to them, right? So what's the halacha? Okay, so actually before we get to this, so he goes and he says to them, I'm paying you, right? And essentially, go use this money to go ahead and purchase for yourself food and drink. Okay, either that's their payment or supplemental wages, whatever it is. He's giving them here, right? Here's money. Go and drink. Go and eat. So we'll say now the Gemara says ve'ino choshesh. He could do this. Ve'ino choshesh. He doesn't have to be worried. Samach Yom base 63b. Lo mishum shvius v'lo mishum meiser v'lo mishum yayin nesach. Now we'll say, and here's what's interesting about this. Right? What's the concern over here? The Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, he's giving them money. Now, because it's an akum or amei aretz, he has to be concerned. Maybe the akum is going to go by yayin nesach, right? Or maybe ultimately again the amei aretz is going to buy shmita produce or meiser sheni produce and consume it outside of Yerushalayim. He doesn't have to be concerned with this. Why doesn't he have to be concerned with this? Because essentially he's giving them the money and he's saying, Chevra, do what you want. Do what you want. Because he's doing that, essentially, it's not on him. Whatever they do, they do. Rashi says over here, okay, Rashi just goes through all of this. Right, if you look at the end, if you look at Rashi, V'lo mishum meiser, right, if you look at Rashi, it's actually the last wide line, the last of the long lines, not Rashi. The ha'ihu lo safilu midi ela priti yavlahu. We don't view, Ruvain is not the one giving them anything prohibited. Ruvain is giving them money. And it's Chavra, here, this is for your food, this is for your drink. What they choose to do with that afterwards, essentially, is not on Ruvain. It's not on Ruvain, so therefore, again, no liability. Okay, now watch. Contrast that with the following case. Samach Yom 63b, second line down. V'im amar lahem, but if he said to them, Su ve'ichlu v'ani porea, Su ushtu v'ani porea, but if he says to the workers, right, donkey drivers, go and eat, go and drink, and I'll pay, I'll pick up the tab. Oh, now this is a problem. Choshish mishum shvius umishum meiser mishum yayin nesach. Then we have a problem. Now why is that? Look at Rashi. Ve'ino v'ani porea. Havi'ihu lokeach ha'isu machilo dehashtalo salak nafshi minav. The issue over here is because he's paying the tab, now it looks like he's purchasing and providing these prohibited items for his workers. You see the difference? If Ruvain just says, here's $100 for your food and drink, whatever they buy, that's on them. It has nothing to do with him. If he says, go eat, go drink, I'll pick up the tab, then ultimately, again, that is problematic because it is as if he is purchasing and providing these potentially prohibited items for his workers. Alma, what do you see from here? Ki kapara deme iser kapara. So what you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, and again, this is we're now going ahead and circling back to the Rabbi Yanai case, right? We're going back now ultimately again to the Rabbi Yanai case of, remember, Rabbi Yanai, what did they do? They went ahead and they borrowed Shemitah produce and they repaid the poor with 8th year produce. Rabbi Yochanan said, not a problem because no transactional immediacy. So now the Gemara says, what do you see from this last case over here? Amo ki kapara deme iser kapara. So what do you see from here? That when Ruvain pays the bill, so even though, again, he's paying after the consumption already took place, halacha l'maisa, there is transactional immediacy, and he is considered to be paying for the Shemitah produce, the Meiser Sheni produce, the Yayin Esach, and it's problematic. Therefore, the Gemara says, Hachanami ki kapara deme iser kapara. So too over here by Rabbi Yanai, when they repay in the 8th year, ultimately, again, isn't that called paying for Shemitah produce? Same thing. To which the Gemara says, so no, it's different. In the Ruvain case, right, where he's going ahead and telling the workers, go eat, go drink, I'll pick up the tab. We're talking about where they are purchasing food from a shopkeeper who normally extends credit to Ruvain. Ultimately, because the shopkeeper normally extends credit to Ruvain, ultimately there is transactional immediacy that's happening right there. Literally translated, the shopkeeper acquires his money immediately. Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's actually right across in Rashi, right to the left. The shopkeeper knows that he's going to get paid from Ruvain because he regularly extends credit. So that's it. There is transactional immediacy over here. Ruvain is dealing, in other words, Ruvain is not just saying, stam, go anywhere you want and, buy food, buy drink. He's saying, Chevra, go to the shopkeeper, I'll pick up the tab. This is a shopkeeper who normally extends credit to Ruvain. So therefore, again, it's as if the debt is already paid, and therefore there is transactional immediacy that's happening over here. Rashi says over here, therefore it's considered to be almost like an exchange, right? The shopkeeper is going to give the donkey drivers and the laborers whatever they want, including prohibited items, and Ruvain is going to immediately pay for that. But again, that doesn't apply in the case of Rabbi Yanai, right? This wasn't like a credit type of situation, and these weren't people who normally did business together. Therefore, that case was fine because it lacked transactional immediacy. The Gemara says, Aval, but again, using that logic, if Reuben were to send out his workers, same case, go eat and go drink, I'll pick up the tab. But now he's not sending him to a shopkeeper who normally extends credit to him, then it sounds like what? Mutter. Then it should be okay. If that's the case, that it's mutter, ihachi, adetani tsa'u ve'echlu b'dinar zeh, tsa'u shesu b'dinar zeh, if that's the case, then set the brisa up differently. Instead of making the first case in the brisa, the case of where Reuben says, here's $100, go out and go eat and go drink, make it two different cases. What should the two cases be? The Gemara said, when is this so ultimately again that it's prohibited? When is it prohibited for Reuven to say to his workers, Chavra, go out and go eat and drink, and I'll pick up the tab? That's only with a shopkeeper who extends credit to Reuven, because there's transactional immediacy, and it's as if, again, the Chenveni already has the money to pay for the prohibited items. But a shopkeeper who does not extend credit, therefore that lacks transactional immediacy, and that case should be fine. In other words, better for the brisa to go ahead and highlight two cases that are the same, but one detail different, than to highlight two dramatically different cases. To which the Gemara says, Va'od, chen b'ni she'ein makifo milo mishtabit. And furthermore, is that true? Even if the shopkeeper doesn't extend credit, is the purchaser not still obligated to the chen b'ni? V'amarava, listen to this. Homer lechavero. A person says to his friend, Tein mana leploni, v'yiknu kol mechase lach. So what happens? So right, Reuven goes, all right, I go over to Reuven. I say, Reuven, do me a favor, give a money to Shimon, and all of my property will become encumbered to you. What's the halacha? Kana medina, if ultimately, again, my property becomes encumbered as a guarantor. The Gemara says, so what do you see from here? Now, again, that's even assuming that Reuben and I have no previous relationship. So what do you see from here? When you ask someone to go out and give something to someone else, and ultimately, again, you're guaranteeing it, that encumbrance, that transactional immediacy, seems to occur right then and there. You're right. At the end of the day, whether the shopkeeper extends credit or doesn't extend credit doesn't really seem to make a difference. The Gemara says, so the Gemara says, so what's the difference? So if I look at Rashi over here, Rashi says, Kevan lo miyached shibude. Look at Rashi, third wide line in the Rashi's on the bottom. Kevan lo shibude, shelo yiche lo miyat mo'os lekach, lav chalip linhu v'lo mitzar. Since Reuven did not go ahead and actively set aside money for this, right? He's telling his workers, go out, go eat and drink, I'll pick up the tab. Since no defined amount of money, right, or no specific monies have been set aside for that, therefore, again, that lacks transactional immediacy. Because it does ultimately, again, it should be mutter. Shelo yichi le'ma'os lekach lav chalip eninu v'lo mitzar. I'm sorry. The Gemara says, Elahacha amay choshesh. So if that's the case, ultimately, again, so what do we need to be concerned about? Mishum shvius. So the Gemara says, Ha lo miyachet shibudei hachal. So ultimately, again, says the Gemara, ultimately, again, what do I have to be concerned about over here? Elahacha amay choshesh mishum shvius. What do you have to be concerned about over here? That halacha l'maisa, that perhaps, again, shmita produce. The Gemara says, Ha lo miyachet shibudei hachal, lo miyachet shibudei hachal. Ultimately, again, same thing. Halacha l'maisa, because no particular monies have been designated or advanced, it does not create transactional immediacy. Amra papa kegon shehiktim lo dinar. What's the case? The case over here is where the balabayis advanced the money to the chenveni. Okay, so this changes everything. Look at Rashi. Shehiktim lo balabayis dinar lechenveni kodem sheshalach etzlo. The hashtami the balabayis ka'achli v'isurde. Okay, so this changes everything. So now the case over here, ultimately, again, when the Brisa says that if Reuven says to his workers, go to the chenveni, go to the shopkeeper, eat and drink, whatever you want, it's on me. The case is where already Reuven gave the money to the shopkeeper. So there's no extension of credit. In other words, he has a tab, but it's paid for already. Oh, so now that makes sense. Because now that it's paid for already, ultimately, again, if they take prohibited things, it's literally like he's supplying them with prohibited items. So the Gemara says as follows. So Rav Kahana said as follows. So we'll say, so again, all of this is all in this same realm of transactional immediacy, right? That's the theme that's happening over here. So the Gemara says, Amr Papa, Amr Kana, Amrisi l'shmaite kameid Rav Zvid min Arda. So Rav Kana said, I said this over in front of Rav Zvid of Narda. And what happened? Amr le, ihachi adetani tsu'u ve'ichlu tsu'u shesu vani poreh. If that's the case, the Brisa shouldn't read that Reuben says to his workers, go out and eat, go out and drink, and I will pay. I will pay makes it sound like he hasn't paid. Rather, what should it say? Tsu'u ve'ichlu tsu'u shesu vani mechashev. It should say, go out and drink, go out and eat, and then I'll settle up. Right? I'll settle up ultimately again with the shopkeeper. Because again, if we're saying now the case over here is where Reuben prepaid, right? So he left money with the shopkeeper. Then it's a question of saying, okay, I left you $100. How much did they consume? To which the Gemara said, Amalei, you're right. He said, you're right. Tani Amalei Tani tsu'u va'ani mechashev. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, he said, you're right. Change the Brisa to read. The Brisa should really read the following way. That halacha l'maisa, if Reuben says to his, so the case, remember, essentially there are two cases in Brisa. Case number one is where Reuben gives his workers $100. He says, Chavra, go out and eat, go out and drink on me. That case, whatever they do, it's on them. It's not on Reuven. Case two, the way the Gemara is understanding it now, is that halacha l'maisa, Reuven prepaid the chenveni. He went ahead and he gave $100 to the shopkeeper. He said, my worker is going to come in, let them buy, let them eat, let them drink. Okay? Now the Gemara says that's the problematic case. We have to be concerned if they have access now to prohibited food items, because then it's as if Reuben is going ahead and supplying them with prohibited items. And the way that Brisa should read is, Reuben says to his workers, go out and eat, go out and drink, and then I will settle up ultimately again with the shopkeeper afterwards. That's how the Gemara is understanding the case. Okay, Bosai, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone. What a daf. Good halacha, good hashkafa. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.